The Chaconne from Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor for unaccompanied violin is a masterpiece in composition. In this movement, Bach enhances a simple chaconne form with amazing compositional variety to create one of the most intricately beautiful works ever written. This presentation will analyze how Bach combines simplicity and complexity in this great work to create a cohesive variety, which makes this piece powerful to listen to and incredibly difficult to perform. This piece is from the Baroque era, which itself was characterized by a lot of complexity. And part of this was from a theory at the time called the theory of the affections. And it says, one of the sources I was looking at says that it was widely believed that experiencing a range of affections through music could bring the humors into better balance, promoting physical and psychological health, so that both vocal and instrumental works typically offered a succession of contrasting moods. And what this did was, in addition to giving the Baroque era music a lot of complexity of emotion, it also gave special credence to instrumental music as a genre. Until now, vocal music had been considered superior to instrumental music because words were considered more powerful than notes. But the theory of the affections showed that the notes themselves also had healing power and power to affect the emotions. So because of this, the instrumental genre was on the rise during this time. And chamber music was an especially popular form of music at the time. Within this, two common forms were the sonata da chiesa, which is the sonata of the church, and this one had movements that were mostly abstract and a little bit more contemplative. Whereas the sonata da camera, or the chamber sonata, was more focused on dance-like movements. And this chaconne is from one of these sonatas da camera. But what makes this chaconne and the work that it's within a little different is that it is unaccompanied, for unaccompanied violin. And unaccompanied works were fairly rare during this time for a stringed instrument, although they did appear at times. But Bach's pieces for unaccompanied violin are among the greatest that were written at that time and still have been written. So Bach lived in Germany from 1685 to 1750, and while he wrote this piece, he was living in Cöthen, Germany, under the patronage of Duke Leopold, who really loved music, and Bach was kept very busy writing lots of pieces. It was a prosperous time in his career. The year 1720 is when his suites for unaccompanied violin and cello were written. And this was actually a pretty difficult time in his life because his first wife died unexpectedly while he was away on a journey. And he only found out when he returned home that she had already died. So, and at this time, he was also left with the care of his entire family while trying to work a really busy job. So we see some of the pathos of this might have come through in the chaconne, which is a very passionate and dark piece. So the chaconne is from Partita No. 2 in D minor, which is within a set of 6 sonatas and partitas for unaccompanied violin. And 4 of these sonatas and partitas are in minor keys and 2 are in major. They start with a G minor sonata and then gradually get into darker and darker keys until the D minor partita is one of the darkest, and it's at the heart of the entire suite. The chaconne itself is at the end of this partita, and it is like the heart of the entire set before we start traveling back up into the major keys. And this partita is a sonata da camera, which means, again, that we have dance-like movements. So here you can see all 5 movements. The chaconne is the last of all of them, but it is a 12-minute work. So the chaconne itself is about the length of all of the other movements combined. A chaconne, in general, was just a set of variations on a repeating harmonic progression or bass line. And the bass line that Bach uses in his chaconne is a descending tetrachord. And you can see that it descends from the D, which is the tonic, all the way down to the dominant. And this repeats over and over throughout the work, tying it together. In addition, we have an overall form of A for the first 132 measures, and then B, and then A prime again at the end. And these are mostly delineated by the tonality. So the first one is in D minor, obviously. The middle, the B section, is in the parallel major, D major. And then we briefly return to D minor for the last portion. And within each of these, we have these repeating variations in 8 measure phrases throughout each portion. So it kind of ties together within this ternary form. So we could describe this entire work as a theme and variations within a larger ternary form. So let's listen to a little bit of the theme here. So that is our theme. And let's look at it written out here. You can see I've circled the bass line. So we have D, here it's a C sharp, to a B flat, to an A. So the bass line itself lasts only 4 measures, but each phrase, including the theme, is an 8-bar phrase. And you can see I've kind of divided it in half. So the bass line repeats within each 8-bar phrase. So you have two reiterations of the bass line within each phrase of the piece. Then Bach chooses to vary this theme throughout the whole 12-minute work in a variety of ways. He does it through changing rhythm, textures, using ornamentation, and varying up the harmony. So let's look at each of these respectively. First, Bach uses rhythm to vary this theme. And if you remember back in the theme, we mostly have, this is mostly based on the half notes and quarter notes, very stately and slow. But here in measures 25 through 32, we can see that it's already starting to build rhythmic intensity as it goes into 8th notes and then 16th notes. So while the pulse stays the same, the rhythm itself becomes faster and faster. And underneath we still have our descending tetrachord, D, C sharp, B flat, A. So, so throughout this whole initial A section, the rhythmic intensity builds higher and higher and higher until we get to a climactic point. So then soon we get into 32nd notes, even faster rhythms. And this, while we still have the same bass line, our D, C, B flat, and A, the feel here is very different because in the opening we had the stately chords, and here it feels much more dance-like, almost like a jig. And finally, we reach the climactic point here at the end of the A section with coming out of the 32nd notes, we get into something called variolage, and this is my personal favorite part of the piece, where the violinist holds chords in his or her left hand, and then the bow arpeggiates very quickly on these chords. So let's listen to the 32nd notes leading into the variolage, which is the climax of the A section. I wish we could just listen to the whole thing. It's so awesome. So you can see that this is the climax of the entire A section. We've gradually built up these variations through rhythm. And then let's look at texture next. So Bach uses a variety of textures throughout this piece to give it some variety. So we have double stops where the violinist plays multiple notes at the same time, and even within the double stops there's a huge variety of textures you can get with the different numbers of voices in the harmony. So here sometimes double stops are just two voices at a time right here, or at times it can be three voices altogether, kind of like this, although this is still two, I guess. But then finally, you can have four notes at a time, and this gets a little tricky to play, but it's a very impressive sound and a much different texture. And then besides double stops, we also have a lot of single lines of running notes, which gives a huge variety of sounds even within this. So you can have running 30-second notes here, which are all separate bows, and it gives it an urgent feel, almost like a race. Whereas over here we have our 16th note triplets, and these are slurred, so it has a much more kind of buoyant, rounded feel. It's interesting to note that Bach played violin, organ, and harpsichord, and all of these instruments sort of are hinted at with the textures and these variations. The organ you can see in the sustained huge chords, and the harpsichord is hinted at with the fast flurries of running notes like this. And then obviously it's a violin piece, so it sounds like violin everywhere. Then we also have ornamentation as a variation technique. A lot of Baroque music during this time was considered or was supposed to be improvisatory. And while this piece sounds improvisatory, Bach actually writes out a lot of the ornamentation very precisely. So let's look at one section here where he does that. He has the bass line still underneath, but then on top he has this trill, which sounds improvised, but it's actually written out clearly. So let's listen here. And so that's one form of ornamentation that he uses. Another way is through chromaticism, and in this way sometimes he even varies the bass line, although the bass line still technically stays the same overall because we have our D, our C, our B flat, and our A. But within this, the bass line takes a little tour up to A and then travels down chromatically before going to the next like staple note of the bass line. So he kind of ornaments the bass line in this way in addition to the upper voices. Finally, Bach ornaments harmonically. He varies harmonically this theme, and this is one of the coolest ways, I think. He does this in a number of ways. He, first of all, changes the location of the dissonance throughout the work. So by placing the notes with the chords with the most tension on or off the beat, he gets a very different sound. So sometimes he'll emphasize the dissonant chords giving a lot more tension. Other times the chords that release the tension are on the beat, and it sounds much more relaxed in those instances. And at times Bach also chooses to change up the chords that he puts over the bass line. So while the harmonic structure stays similar, it's not the same in every variation. Sometimes when you're expecting a D minor chord, he'll put a D major chord in for fun, or a different diminished chord than you would expect. The most obvious harmonic change is the key change in the B section to D major. And then coming out of this B section to the A prime section, when he returns to D minor, we expect to hear the one chord again over our first note of the descending bass line, like we did at the opening, but actually here he kind of surprises us and starts on the major 6th chord. So let's listen to the end of the major section returning into that A prime. And it sounds similar to the opening theme, but it's a little different. As you can see, there's some embellishing notes here. All right. So we've talked about a lot of the complexity of this work with all of the different variations that Bach chooses to use, variation techniques. But then let's also talk about what makes this piece simple, or at least ties it all together. So we've already talked about the descending tetrachord and how this repeats throughout every 4 bars, giving us a sense of cohesiveness. But then there's also some other aspects in which Bach ties together this whole work. One of these is the importance of beat 2, which is significant throughout a lot of these variations. And the whole piece starts on a strong pickup on beat 2, and many of the variations emphasize the second beat as well. In general, the piece is broken up into 8-bar phrases, so structurally that kind of holds together the entire thing. And scale degree 5 is also important throughout the whole work, and you can see this most clearly in the B section where there's a lot of repeated A's. But finally, symmetry ties this whole piece together, and in addition to the A-B-A form, which itself is symmetrical, we can see that the theme at the very beginning is repeated at the very end, almost verbatim, very similarly. So let's listen to how Bach concludes this work. And thus ends the greatest piece of all time, or at least one of them, in my opinion. So we've talked about compositionally how this work holds together. So let's finish by talking a little bit about performance practice. I like this quote. Despite the fact that almost every great violin player for the last 2 centuries has performed the piece, there is still a sense that the most appropriate way to play it, especially the large burden of double, triple, and even quadruple stops, has not been found. And this is definitely true. If you look up recordings of this piece, no 2 recordings are alike, and there's a wide variety of thoughts and opinions about how to interpret it, but no one really knows for sure. And some of the difficulties with this interpretation of this piece come from the fact that it is so simple and yet so complex. So all the motivic and textural variety make this difficult to perform as a cohesive whole sometimes. It's easy to make it sound like a whole bunch of 8-bar movements in a way, because it's so many variations. Also, you have 2 structures going on at the same time, the motivic structure and the baseline structure, and they don't necessarily always line up. Sometimes they overlap. So for phrasing purposes, it can be difficult to know which one to emphasize. Personally, I think after doing this research that the complexity of the piece is much more obvious than the simplicity. And so I think by emphasizing some of the things that hold this whole work together while still exploring different colors of sound that Bach brings out, I think it's important to keep these within the range of the overall form and have an overarching sense of how this piece fits together as a whole, and then even within the whole partita, kind of paying attention to the large scale form is important. So as we have seen, both complexity and simplicity combine in this work to make a multifaceted, cohesive whole, and one of the greatest masterpieces of the violin repertoire. This piece is personally one of my favorites, and I hope this inspires you to listen to the whole work with these things in mind. Thank you.